The eviction notice hit the dusty floorboards of the Donnelly homestead like a gunshot, and Annie did not flinch. Sheriff Eli Wilcox stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly filling the frame, the afternoon sun cutting hard shadows across the angles of his jaw. He had ridden out from Caldwell with a folded document in one hand and a look on his face that said he had done this before and liked it even less each time. His badge caught the light. His jaw was tight. His eyes, gray as a coming storm, swept the interior of the small but meticulously organized homestead and landed on the woman standing behind the oak table like she was defending a fortress. Annie Donnelly had both palms pressed flat against a spread of papers, land surveys, ink-stained ledgers, and territorial maps so precisely annotated they looked like they belonged in a federal courthouse, rather than a one-room Kansas homestead. She was 27 years old, with dark copper hair twisted back in a practical knot, ink permanently staining her right forefinger, and eyes the color of river amber that were, at this moment, burning with the specific ferocity of someone who had already won a fight the other party did not yet know they were losing. "You have until sundown to vacate the premises," Eli said, keeping his voice level. He laid the eviction notice on the edge of her table because he was not the kind of man who threw things. "Mr. Harlan Creed has filed a legitimate claim through the Caldwell Land Office. The deed is registered. The ruling is official. I don't make the laws, ma'am. I enforce them." Annie looked at the eviction, noticed the way a hawk looks at something small and foolish in an open field. "Sheriff," she said, and her voice was calm, which was somehow more alarming than shouting, "that deed Mr. Creed registered is fraudulent. Not allegedly fraudulent. Not disputable. Fatally, legally, provably fraudulent. And I can prove it in 4 minutes with the documents I am currently holding in my hands." Eli Wilcox had been the sheriff of Sumner County for 3 years. He had faced down cattle rustlers, bank robbers, and a man in Wichita who had thrown a cast-iron skillet at his head. He had never in his life been stopped cold by a sentence delivered in a quiet woman's voice over a table full of papers, but something in the absolute, bone-deep certainty of her tone made him pause with his hand still on the edge of the table. "You have 4 minutes," he said, and pulled out a chair. What happened in those next 4 minutes would alter the course of both their lives completely, though neither of them could have known it yet. To understand how Annie Donnelly came to be standing in that farmhouse with the legal fate of her land in her hands, and how Eli Wilcox came to be the man who was supposed to destroy everything she had built, you had to go back 6 weeks to the morning Annie arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, with a carpetbag full of documents, and a mission that most people in this county would have called impossible. The year was 1883, and Caldwell, Kansas sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail, a town that smelled like cattle and ambition and was run, as most cattle towns were, by the people who had the money and the patience to file paperwork while everyone else was too busy surviving to read it. The cattle drives had made certain men very wealthy very quickly, and wealthy men in 1883 had a particular habit of looking at land they did not own and deciding it should be theirs. Harlan Creed was one of those men. He owned the Creed Cattle Company, a vast operation that pushed thousands of head of longhorns up from Texas every season, and he had his eye on a particular corridor of grazing land along the Ninesca River that happened to include 4 homesteads belonging to families who had settled there under the Homestead Act of 1862. The Donnelly homestead was one of them. The other 3 families had already accepted Creed's buyout offers or been scared into abandoning their claims. Only Annie remained. Annie was not a typical homesteader. She had not come west to farm or raise cattle. She had come west because her father, Patrick Donnelly, had filed his homestead claim in 1871 and built a decent life on that land before a fever took him in the winter of 1879. He had left the property to Annie, his only child, along with his tools, his Bible, and his absolute conviction that the land was lawfully hers, and that no amount of money or intimidation should ever make her give it up. Patrick Donnelly had also left Annie something else: an education, an unusual and exceptionally practical education for a woman of her era. Patrick had spent 15 years before coming west as a land deed clerk in Philadelphia. He had taught Annie everything he knew about property law, deed registration, chain of title, and the specific language of territorial land grants. He had spent evenings at their kitchen table walking her through the legal documents that governed the land they lived on, making sure she understood every clause, every implication, every potential weakness a dishonest man might try to exploit. He had been, in his own quiet way, preparing her for exactly this moment. Annie had spent the last year and a half after her father's death not grieving idly. She had built herself into something extraordinary. She had corresponded with land clerks in 3 territories, had apprenticed herself briefly to a deed examiner in Topeka, who said she had the sharpest eye for document fraud he had ever encountered in 20 years of practice, and had returned to Caldwell with a knowledge of land title law that exceeded that of most practicing attorneys in the region. When Harlan Creed's men first arrived at her door 6 weeks ago with a buyout offer she recognized immediately as insultingly low, she had not screamed or wept or gone running to town for help. She had smiled politely, shown them out, and immediately ridden to the Caldwell land office to pull the deed records for every parcel Creed had registered or attempted to register in the last 3 years. What she found there lit something cold and electric in her chest. Creed's deed to her land, the one he had filed just 2 weeks prior, contained a chain of title that referenced a land grant originally issued by the territorial government in 1867. Annie knew that grant. She had studied it. She had her father's original copy of it annotated in his neat hand, and the version Creed had filed was not quite the same as the original. The difference was small, almost imperceptible. A single surveying notation in the boundary description that shifted the southeastern corner marker by what appeared to be a minor clerical adjustment. But Annie had recognized it immediately for what it was: not a clerical error, a deliberate alteration, one designed to expand Creed's claimed boundary by just enough to swallow the Donnelly homestead whole. The fraud was elegant and quiet, and almost certainly would have gone unnoticed by anyone who had not spent years studying exactly this kind of document. But Annie had spent years studying exactly this kind of document. The problem was that knowing something and proving it legally were 2 different territories. And the further problem was that Creed had powerful friends. The county recorder, a man named Aldous Finch, had processed his deed with suspicious speed and no questions asked. The land office clerk had suddenly developed a remarkable lack of memory when Annie asked him about the timeline. And then, 3 days ago, the official eviction notice had been filed with the sheriff's office. That was when Eli Wilcox entered the story. Eli had come to Caldwell 3 years ago from Missouri, where he had served as a deputy for 2 terms before a combination of restlessness and a dark past he did not discuss publicly had pushed him further west. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had been described by the women of Caldwell's church circle as troublingly handsome in a weather-beaten sort of way. He wore his badge with the particular brand of seriousness that came from a man who had decided at some point that integrity was the only thing worth keeping. He had heard of Harlan Creed. He had heard the whispers about the buyouts and the pressure campaigns, had seen 2 of the other homestead families load their wagons and leave with hollow eyes and tightly pressed mouths. He had not had legal cause to intervene. Property disputes were civil matters, not criminal ones, until they weren't, and no one had filed a complaint with his office that gave him standing to act. When the eviction notice came across his desk, signed and sealed by a circuit court judge from Wichita who had received a very generous campaign contribution from Creed's business associates the previous year, Eli had read it 3 times. He was not a man who liked the feeling sitting in his stomach when he looked at that document. But the law was the law, and the document was, on its surface, entirely legitimate. He had ridden out to the Donnelly homestead with the notice because that was his job. He had not expected Annie Donnelly. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, a grieving widow or a frightened young woman who would cry and then comply. What he found instead was a woman who looked at him like she had been expecting him and had been preparing for this exact conversation for weeks. He sat down at her table because something in her voice had demanded it, and Annie Donnelly laid out her case. She did not explain it gently or cautiously. She laid the original 1867 territorial grant on the table and placed Creed's filed deed beside it, and pointed to the surveying notation with the certainty of a surgeon identifying a wound. "The original grant," she said, "uses the notation TPRM. Designate the reference meridian. That is the standard notation for the territorial principal reference meridian established for Kansas Territory in 1855. Every deed in this county that references this grant uses that notation. Every single one. I have checked 47 of them." She slid a handwritten list across the table toward him. The list was meticulous, numbered with corresponding deed registry numbers beside each entry. Eli looked at the list. Then he looked at her. "Creed's filed deed," Annie continued, "uses SBRM. That notation does not exist in Kansas territorial surveying records. It appears to be a reference to a Missouri reference meridian system that was used briefly in the 1840s and is entirely inapplicable to land grants issued in Kansas Territory. The use of this notation shifts the southeastern boundary marker of the grant by approximately 340 feet in a southwesterly direction, which is precisely the amount needed to absorb my father's original homestead claim into the boundary of the Creed deed." She paused and let that sink in. "The fraud was designed to look like a surveying abbreviation error," she said. "But it is not an error. I have the original surveyor's field notes from 1867 in the Territorial Archive in Topeka. I requested copies 6 weeks ago. She placed them on the table. They were clearly dated, clearly official, and clearly inconsistent with Creed's filed deed. The room was very quiet. Outside, a meadowlark called from somewhere in the tall grass along the Nineska. The afternoon light was falling at a long, golden angle through the window, catching the dust motes and the edges of all those carefully organized papers, and catching, too, the expression on Sheriff Eli Wilcox's face, which was something Annie had not entirely expected to see. He was not dismissive. He was not condescending. He was not looking at her like a man waiting for her to finish so he could explain why she was wrong. He was reading the documents, carefully. His gray eyes moved across the surveying notation comparison she had written out, line by line, and his jaw had tightened into something that was not skepticism, but rather the look of a man whose understanding of a situation was undergoing a rapid and uncomfortable revision. "You're saying Creed had the deed altered before he filed it," Eli said. "I am saying the deed that was filed does not match the original source document it claims to be derived from," Annie said carefully. "The legal conclusion from that discrepancy, under Kansas territorial property law, Section 14 of the 1867 Land Grant Verification Act, is that the filed deed is void ab initio, void from the beginning, as if it never existed, which means the eviction notice derived from it is equally void." Eli set the document down. He looked at Annie Donnelly across the table for a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes that was not quite professional admiration, though it was that too. "Who else have you shown this to?" he asked. "No one yet," she said. "You are the first person outside my own 4 walls who has seen this analysis. I was waiting for the official confrontation because I needed to know whether the law in this county was actually the law or whether it was Harlan Creed wearing a badge." That last sentence was delivered without particular inflection, but it landed on Eli Wilcox like a thrown stone. He felt the weight of it, the unfairness it implied. The fact that she had been sitting out here alone for 6 weeks, armed with nothing but her intelligence and her documents, waiting to see if the system would actually protect her or would arrive to destroy her wearing an official face. He felt a sudden, fierce, complicated anger that he recognized immediately was not primarily directed at Annie Donnelly. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was quieter now, "I need you to understand that I came here today to enforce a legal document. I did not come here as Creed's man. I have never been Creed's man, and I do not intend to become one today." Annie studied him for a long, measuring moment. She had very good instincts about people. 27 years of watching her father navigate the specific corruptions of property law had given her an eye for when someone was telling the truth and when they were performing the truth, and those were very different things. "Then, what do you intend to do, Sheriff?" she asked. "I intend," Eli said, standing up and picking up the eviction notice he had laid on her table, "to take this back to town and file an official inquiry with the county recorder's office regarding the chain of title discrepancy you have identified. I intend to do that today, before sundown, and I intend to ensure that no one moves a single item off this property until that inquiry is formally closed." Something moved in Annie's eyes that was not quite relief and not quite trust, but was the very cautious beginning of both. "You should know," she said, "that Aldous Finch at the county recorder's office processed Creed's deed. He may not be cooperative." "I wasn't planning on asking for his cooperation," Eli said. He rode back to Caldwell that afternoon with the eviction notice in his saddlebag, and a head full of thoughts that had very little to do with property law. He found Aldous Finch at the recorder's office, a small, sweating man who had the particular nervous quality of someone carrying a secret that had recently become heavier than he expected. When Eli laid the surveying notation discrepancy in front of him, Finch's face did something complicated and unhappy. "The deed was filed in proper order," Finch said, not meeting Eli's eyes. "I processed it according to standard procedure." "Did you compare it to the original 1867 grant document?" Eli asked, a pause. "The filing was based on the documents presented by Mr. Creed's representatives." "That is not what I asked," Eli said. "Did you compare it to the original?" Another pause. "That is not standard procedure for deed filings," Finch said carefully. Eli looked at him for a moment. "Finch," he said, "I am going to ask you one more question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer it. Did anyone ask you to process this deed without the standard chain of title verification that your own office's regulations require for grants dated prior to 1870? The silence in the recorder's office was the kind that had a shape to it. "I think," Finch said finally quietly, "that I may have processed this filing with more haste than the regulations technically require." "I think so too," Eli said. "I am going to need the full filing record for this deed, every document, every correspondence, and I am going to need it this afternoon." He walked out of the recorder's office with a stack of files and a clearer picture of the trap Annie Donnelly had been caught in. Creed had not simply filed a fraudulent deed. He had apparently applied pressure to the county recorder to expedite it without proper verification. Whether that pressure was financial or something more threatening, Eli intended to find out. He found out sooner than expected when, walking back across the main street of Caldwell toward his office, he was intercepted by Harlan Creed himself. Creed was a large man, the kind of large that had once been physical and was now financial, dressed in a fine wool coat that looked improbable in the Kansas heat. He had the smile of a man who had never in his life been told no by anyone he considered worth worrying about. "Sheriff Wilcox," he said pleasantly, "I heard you rode out to the Donnelly place this afternoon. I hope the matter was handled smoothly." "The matter is under inquiry," Eli said. Creed's smile did not change, but something behind it did. "Under inquiry," he repeated. "That's an interesting choice of words for an open and shut eviction." "Chain of title discrepancy," Eli said. I'm not in the habit of enforcing eviction orders derived from deeds with unresolved title questions. You know that." "I do know that," Creed said. "I also know that the judge in Wichita has already issued the order. I would hate for a simple procedural delay to create any professional difficulties for you, Sheriff." There it was, wrapped in polite language, wearing good wool but unmistakably a threat. Eli looked at Creed with the specific patience of a man who had been threatened by people considerably more frightening than a cattle baron in a good coat. "Mr. Creed," he said, "if you're suggesting that my professional standing is conditional on the outcome of this inquiry, I want you to think very carefully about whether you'd like to say that again in front of witnesses." Creed's smile thinned. He nodded once pleasantly and walked away, which was in Eli's experience more alarming than a man who stayed and argued. That evening, Eli sat in his office with Finch's files and the notes he had taken at Annie's table, and he began building a case. Not an eviction case. The opposite. A fraud case. The next morning he rode back to the Donnelly homestead, and this time he did not come with an eviction notice. Annie was in the yard when he arrived, checking on the vegetable garden she maintained along the south fence line with the methodical care of someone who understood that food security on the frontier was not a romantic notion but a practical necessity. She looked up when she heard hoofbeats, and her expression sharpened with a readiness that he was beginning to recognize as simply how her face sat when something potentially threatening appeared. "Good morning," he said, dismounting. "Is it?" she said, not quite a question. "I spent last night reviewing Finch's filing records," he said. "You were right about the haste. There are 3 separate documents in the standard chain of title verification protocol that were skipped entirely during Creed's deed registration. And there's a letter from Creed's land agent to Finch, dated the day before the filing, that is interesting reading." Annie set down her gardening trowel. "How interesting." "The phrase, 'your continued cooperation will be remembered at the next appropriations meeting,' is in it," Eli said, "which, depending on how a judge reads it, constitutes either a bribe or very close proximity to one." Something happened in Annie's face. It was not softening, exactly. It was more like a tightly held thing shifting slightly under the pressure of something unexpected, which in this case was a law enforcement officer who appeared to be actually doing his job. "Come inside," she said. They spent 3 hours at that kitchen table, Annie and Eli, building the legal framework that would challenge Creed's deed. Annie's knowledge of property law directed the argument. Eli's knowledge of the county's procedural requirements and the specific witnesses who might be compelled to testify gave it its spine. They worked well together in a way that surprised both of them, a kind of intellectual collaboration that neither had experienced before because neither had previously met a person whose mind worked in a complementary way to their own. Annie was precise, encyclopedic, and several moves ahead. Eli was practical, politically aware, and willing to follow a line of reasoning wherever it went without the defensive pride that made lesser men dismiss expertise they didn't personally possess. At some point around the second hour, Eli had said something about the specific territorial statute that covered deed fraud, quoted it halfway and then paused, and Annie had completed the quotation, word for word from memory, including the subsection number. He had looked at her with an expression she would think about for a long time afterward. Not just impressed, something deeper than impressed. A kind of recognition, like a man who had been looking for a particular landmark on a long journey and had just found it where he least expected to. "Where did you learn all of this?" he asked. "My father," she said simply. And then, because something about the directness of his interest invited it, she told him about Patrick Donnelly. The evenings at the kitchen table, the annotated documents, the deliberate and loving education that had been her father's best gift to her, the deed examiner in Topeka who had said she had a gift. Eli listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. "Your father sounds like a remarkable man," he said when she finished. "He was," Annie said, and her voice was even, but there was something just below its surface. "I'm sorry you lost him," Eli said, and it was so straightforwardly genuine that Annie looked at him sideways for a moment, as though checking for something, and then simply said, "Thank you." That afternoon, Eli rode back to Caldwell and filed a formal fraud inquiry with the circuit court in Wichita, attaching Annie's analysis, the original surveyor's field notes, and the letter from Creed's land agent to Finch. He sent it by the afternoon mail stage with a covering letter that was precise and thorough, and left very little room for interpretation. He also posted a notice at the recorder's office, formally suspending the eviction order pending resolution of the title inquiry. Finch had gone pale when Eli set it on his desk. Eli had told him, with characteristic lack of ceremony, that voluntary cooperation with the fraud inquiry would be considered significantly more favorably than compelled testimony in a court proceeding. Finch had chosen cooperation. What followed was 2 weeks of a particular kind of siege, less dramatic than bullets but no less dangerous. Creed's men began appearing at the edges of Annie's property with increasing regularity, not doing anything overtly threatening but simply being present, visible, a pressure. 2 of her nearest neighbors, who had already sold to Creed, stopped acknowledging her in town. The woman who ran the dry goods store, who had always been friendly, became suddenly and conspicuously cool. Annie noticed all of it. She was not oblivious, and she was not frightened in the way Creed intended her to be frightened, but she was not untouched by it either. Isolation was its own kind of weapon, and she felt its edges. Eli noticed her noticing. He had taken to stopping by the Donnelly homestead every 2 or 3 days, ostensibly to update her on the progress of the fraud inquiry, which was moving through the circuit court with the glacial patience of legal machinery, but in practice also to check on her. He told himself this was professional diligence. He was not entirely convincing. Their conversations at her kitchen table had evolved. They still talked about the case, the documents, the expected timeline of the court's response. But they had also started talking about other things. He told her about Missouri, about the reasons he had come west, which were layered and not entirely happy, but which he found himself willing to describe to her in a way he had not been willing to describe them to anyone in Caldwell. She told him about Topeka and the deed examiner, about the specific satisfaction of finding a flaw in a document that everyone else had declared clean, about what it felt like to be very good at something that most people did not know existed as a skill. One afternoon, 3 weeks into the inquiry, there was a thunderstorm that arrived with very little warning over the Kansas plain and converted the road between Annie's homestead and Caldwell into an impassable soup of red mud in approximately 45 minutes. Eli had been at the homestead when it hit, and had spent 3 hours sitting at her kitchen table while rain hammered the roof and lightning illuminated the prairie in white sheets. And they had talked, really talked, in the unguarded way that storms sometimes create by making the rest of the world feel temporarily unreachable. He told her about his father, who had been a difficult man in the specific way of men who were disappointed by their own lives, and transmitted that disappointment outward in all directions. He told her about the deputy work in Missouri and the dark incident that had preceded his departure, which involved a corrupt county judge and a piece of evidence that Eli had refused to suppress, and that had cost him his position and his engagement to a woman named Clara Pierce, who had, on reflection, been more interested in the position than the man. He had not told anyone in Caldwell any of that. He was mildly surprised to hear himself saying it now. Annie listened the way she did everything, with complete, focused attention, and when he finished she said, "You gave up everything you had built rather than compromise what was right." "I gave up everything I had built and gained nothing except a clear conscience and a one-way ticket to Kansas," he said dryly. "That seems like a reasonable trade," she said, and there was something in her voice that was warm and very direct, and Eli Wilcox, who was generally considered an emotionally reserved man by those who knew him, felt something move in his chest that was entirely different from legal deliberation. The rain continued for another hour, and they drank coffee and talked about books, which turned out to be a subject on which both of them had opinions, and argued productively about the relative merits of Cooper and Twain. And by the time the storm broke and the sky turned a luminous washed gold, the feeling in the room between them was something neither had named but both were acutely aware of. When he rode away that evening through the post-storm clarity of the prairie, Eli thought about Annie Donnelly with an intensity that was beginning to be difficult to classify as professional concern. The crisis came in the fourth week. Creed, apparently concluding that the legal process was not moving in his preferred direction, decided to accelerate matters with a tactic that moved the situation from the civil to the criminal, though not in the way he intended. Annie had ridden to Caldwell on a Tuesday morning to visit the land office for additional documentation. While she was gone, two men arrived at the Donnelly homestead, broke the lock on the door, and spent several hours inside it. When Annie returned in the afternoon, she knew immediately that someone had been in her space. A professional disorder had been imposed on her meticulous organization. Certain documents were missing. Specifically, the copies she had made of the original 1867 surveyor's field notes, which she kept in a locked tin box beneath the kitchen floorboard. The original field notes, however, were not in the tin box. Annie had learned from her father's early and emphatic training never to keep only one copy of a critical document. The originals were stored with a trusted acquaintance in Topeka. The Caldwell copies were her working set, but the theft confirmed something she had suspected. Creed knew about those field notes and understood their significance. He was trying to eliminate the evidence, which meant he also understood that the evidence was damaging enough to destroy his claim. Annie rode straight to the sheriff's office. Eli listened to her account of the break-in with a stillness that those who knew him would have recognized as his particular brand of controlled anger. He asked her 3 specific questions, gathered his deputy, a capable young man named Reese, and within the hour had identified the 2 men responsible as employees of the Creed Cattle Company who had been seen riding out of town toward the Donnelly homestead that morning by 2 separate witnesses. He arrested them by evening. The charges were breaking and entering and theft of documents, and the arrest of 2 Creed employees in connection with the destruction of evidence in an active fraud inquiry sent a very clear message through Caldwell about where things stood with the sheriff's office. Creed, Eli learned through an informant the following morning, was furious in the specific way of powerful men who discover that the people they assumed were manageable are not. Annie came to the sheriff's office the morning after the arrest to formally register her witness statement. And when she walked in and saw Eli at his desk with the arrest report and the recovered evidence, she stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression that was very controlled and very much the expression of a woman who had been holding a great deal together by herself for a very long time and was only now beginning to feel how heavy it had been. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady but her hands were not entirely. Eli stood up. He was across the room in 4 steps before he fully registered the decision to move, and he did not reach for her because that was not something he would do without permission, but he stood close enough that the intention was clear and said, "Annie, are you all right?" She looked at him and the armor was still there but there were seams in it and she said, "I will be. I always am. It's only that it's been a long 6 weeks." "Longer than 6 weeks," he said, because he had been listening and he understood that she had been holding this land and this fight since her father died in 1879. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down in the chair across from his desk and he sat across from her and she said, "Tell me honestly, do you think the circuit court will rule in my favor?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Your analysis is correct, your documentation is sound, and the evidence of procedural fraud in the recorder's office is on record. I think they will rule for you, but I also think Creed is going to make the next several weeks very uncomfortable in the meantime." "He already has," Annie said. "I know," Eli said, And I want you to know that my office's position on this case is not going to change regardless of what pressure Creed applies. That is not a professional statement. That is a personal one. The distinction was small and deliberate, and Annie received it as such. She was quiet for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not accusing, genuinely wanting to understand. "You could have enforced the eviction and no one in this county would have blamed you. The document was official. You had legal cover." Eli was quiet for a moment too. He had been asking himself the same question with increasing frequency, and the honest answer was multi-layered in a way he was not ready to present in full. "Because the document was wrong," he said, "and I knew it was wrong the moment I saw your face when I laid it on your table. And because being a lawman means the law is supposed to actually protect people, not be used as a weapon against them. And because your father spent years making sure you knew how to fight this kind of fight, and that work deserves to succeed." He paused. Then, because he was an honest man even when honesty was inconvenient, he added, "And because I would very much like to see Harlan Creed lose." Annie laughed at that, a real laugh, and it was the first time he had seen her laugh, and it altered her face in a way that altered something in the room. "So would I," she said. They were both quiet again, but it was a different quality of quiet than it had been 6 weeks ago. The circuit court's preliminary ruling arrived 12 days later. It was, as Eli had predicted, in Annie's favor on the question of the deed's validity. The court found that the surveying notation discrepancy constituted a fatal defect in the title chain, which rendered Creed's filed deed void under Section 14 of the 1867 Land Grant Verification Act, exactly as Annie had argued. The eviction order was vacated. Creed's claim to the Donnelly property was nullified. The news arrived on a Friday morning, delivered to Eli's office by the mail rider, and Eli read it twice to make sure he had understood it correctly, and then rode to the Donnelly homestead at a pace that was significantly faster than strictly necessary. Annie was at her kitchen table when he arrived, working on a letter she was drafting to the Territorial Archives in Topeka, because Annie Donnelly was the kind of person who never entirely stopped working. He came through the doorway with the court document in his hand and said, "The ruling came." She looked up. She saw his face. She was out of her chair before he could say another word. "In my favor," she said. "Completely," he said. "Void deed. Vacated eviction. They adopted your legal argument almost word for word." Annie Donnelly closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, 4 years of holding everything together, the grief and the fight and the isolation and the 6 weeks of siege, moved through her face in a way that no one else on earth had ever seen. Then she opened her eyes, and they were bright, and she looked at Eli Wilcox standing in her doorway holding the document that confirmed she had won, and she crossed the remaining distance between them and took the court ruling out of his hand and read every single word of it while standing 2 feet from him, which was not a thing she had done with any of the other documents they had reviewed together. She read it all the way through. Then she looked up at him. They were close enough that the space between them was conspicuous. "Section 14, she said. Her voice was just above a whisper. "Section 14, he confirmed. Then Eli Wilcox, who was generally considered a restrained and professional man, put his hand alongside her face with a gentleness that seemed to belong to a different person than the broad-shouldered, badge-wearing frontier sheriff who had ridden to her door 6 weeks ago to enforce her eviction. And Annie Donnelly, who was generally considered self-sufficient to the point of unapproachability, turned her face slightly into his hand. And neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. He did not kiss her that day. He was not the kind of man who moved without certainty, and this was a territory he intended to enter correctly. But something was established between them in that moment that was as clear and documented as any deed Annie had ever studied, an undeniable claim, freely given on both sides. The broader aftermath of the ruling was considerably noisier. Creed's response to the court decision was to file an appeal, which was his legal right and which Annie had anticipated. She had already begun preparing the supplementary documentation for the appeal defense before the primary ruling had even arrived, because that was who she was. The appeal would take time, but she was not worried about it. The legal framework of her case was sound. She had built it to last. What she had not entirely prepared for was the public reaction in Caldwell. The story of how a lone woman with a knowledge of property law had defeated a cattle baron's fraudulent land grab by finding a fatal flaw in his filed deed traveled through Sumner County like prairie fire. The Caldwell commercial printed a piece about it that was picked up by the Wichita Eagle. People who had been cold to Annie for 6 weeks suddenly found warmth again. The dry goods store owner apologized, somewhat awkwardly, over the counter. And the 3 other homestead families who had sold their land to Creed under pressure began to ask Annie whether the same legal analysis might apply to the deeds they had signed. That was when Annie's work became something significantly larger than her own survival. She spent the next 3 weeks reviewing the deeds for all 3 families. 2 of them were straightforward sales under duress, which was morally monstrous but legally difficult to challenge. But the third, belonging to a family named the Beaumonts, contained a different variety of the same fraud. The same incorrect surveying notation, applied to a different boundary line. Suggesting the alteration was a template, not a one-time improvisation. When Annie presented this finding to Eli, the expression on his face was something she was coming to know well, a certain quality of focused attention that preceded action. He used the same method more than once, Eli said. Which means it was systematic, Annie said. Which means someone with knowledge of surveying notation helped him construct it. This was not a cattle rancher sitting down with a quill pen and inventing fraudulent land codes. He had professional assistants. They looked at each other. The Creed land agent, Eli said, the one who wrote the letter to Finch. His name is Royce Chandler, Annie said. He was a surveyor's assistant in Missouri before he came west. Eli was already reaching for his hat. The arrest of Royce Chandler 4 days later, on charges of conspiracy to commit deed fraud and bribery of a public official, was the event that effectively ended Harlan Creed's position in Sumner County. With Chandler in custody and facing the prospect of a significant prison sentence, the layers of the scheme came apart with considerable speed. Chandler had kept meticulous records, the specific professional habit of a man with a surveyor's background, and those records documented exactly how the boundary notation fraud had been constructed and applied to multiple properties. Creed himself was not arrested, at least not immediately. His attorneys were very good and he had plausible deniability from the specific executions of the fraud, which had been carried out entirely by Chandler. But the civil liability was substantial, and the reputational damage was total. He sold the Creed Cattle Company's Kansas operations before the following spring and relocated to Texas, which was, as Eli said with very dry satisfaction, Texas's problem now. The Beaumont family's deed was eventually invalidated through the same legal analysis Annie had applied to her own, and though the land had been sold on and partially developed, a negotiated settlement restored a significant portion of the value to the Beaumonts. The other 2 families had less legal recourse but were compensated modestly from the civil judgment against the Creed operation, which was, Annie acknowledged, imperfect justice. But it was some justice, which was better than none. Aldous Finch resigned from the county recorder's office, accepted a formal censure, and avoided criminal charges in exchange for his complete cooperation with the fraud investigation. He left Caldwell and was not much mourned. Through all of this, Annie and Eli continued to spend time together at her kitchen table, reviewing documents, discussing strategy, debating the progress of the case. The professional collaboration remained real and substantial, but the other thing between them was also growing, quietly and steadily, with the particular quality of something that was rooting deep rather than spreading fast. He brought her a book one afternoon that he had ordered from a bookshop in Wichita because she had mentioned, during the thunderstorm conversation, that she had wanted to read it for 2 years but had not found a way to obtain it in Caldwell. She received it with an expression that was briefly and entirely unguarded before she collected herself and said formally, "That was very thoughtful of you." "It was nothing," he said. "It wasn't," she said more quietly, and looked at him over the cover of the book in a way that made very clear that she knew the difference. She made him a proper dinner one evening when he had stayed late to help her organize the Beaumont case documentation, something she did not generally do for people, and he ate it with the particular appreciation of a man who had been living on his own cooking for 3 years, and said it was very good, and she told him the recipe had been her mother's, who had died when Annie was 12, and he said quietly that he was sorry for that too, and she said with her chin up that it was a long time ago. And he said gently that time didn't always make that particular kind of loss smaller, and she set down her fork and looked at him. "No," she said, "it doesn't." They sat at the cleared table in the lamplight and talked about their families and their losses, and the specific shapes of who they had become because of them. And when the evening had become very late and the lamp very low, Eli Wilcox leaned across the corner of the table and kissed Annie Donnelly with the care of a man who had been thinking about nothing else for 6 weeks and wanted to do it right. She kissed him back with the directness that characterized everything she did, and after a moment she pulled back and looked at him with those river-amber eyes and said, "I want to be very clear that this is something I am choosing freely and with complete knowledge of my own mind." "I would expect nothing less," he said, and she smiled at him, and it was the smile that was underneath all the other expressions, the real one, and it was, Eli Wilcox thought with a feeling that had no frontier-appropriate language for it, completely extraordinary. The appeal of the circuit court ruling was heard in Wichita that November. Annie attended, presenting her legal analysis directly to the appellate panel in a formal setting that most women of the era would have found intimidating to the point of paralysis. Annie Donnelly found it, by her own account, entirely manageable. She knew her documents better than anyone in that courtroom, including the 2 attorneys Creed had retained from Kansas City, and she addressed every challenge to her analysis with a precision and a calm that left the panel visibly impressed. Eli had ridden to Wichita with her, not because she needed an escort, which she did not, but because he had no intention of missing it and she had not told him not to come. He sat in the gallery and watched her stand before 3 appellate judges and dismantle a 200-page legal challenge with methodical, comprehensive authority and experienced, somewhere around the 2nd hour of the proceeding, the specific sensation of a man watching someone be exactly who they were meant to be. The appeal was denied. Annie's ruling stood. On the ride back from Wichita, through the long golden autumn of the Kansas plain, Annie finally let herself feel the full weight of what she had accomplished. Not in any dramatic way. She was not a dramatic woman by nature. But at some point, with the faded autumn grass on either side of them, and their horses moving at an easy pace and Eli riding beside her close enough that their stirrups occasionally touched, she said, "I think my father would have been pleased." "He would have been much more than pleased," Eli said. "He would have known every day after you walked into that courtroom that he had done the most important thing a father can do." Annie was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon. "What's that?" she asked, though she suspected she knew. "Made sure you could survive without him," Eli said, "and thrive. He made sure you could thrive." She rode the rest of the way back to Caldwell with her hand in Eli's and the late autumn sun at their backs, and she thought that her father had indeed been a remarkable man, and that she had, against considerable odds, and by means of a single fatal legal flaw in a fraudulently filed deed, managed to also find a remarkable one. The winter of 1883 settled over Sumner County with the particular patience of Kansas winters, which were quiet and long, and had a way of pushing people who might otherwise circle each other indefinitely toward some kind of resolution. Eli spent more evenings than could be professionally justified at the Donnelly homestead, always under the visible pretext of case-related matters that had long since been fully resolved, and Annie stopped pretending she was not glad to see him. They had a particular argument in December about the relative merits of two different methods for certifying a secondary deed reference, which lasted 90 minutes and ended with Eli conceding that she was right, which she was, and Annie telling him that he had made a very good point about the procedural ambiguity, which he had, and both of them recognizing that they had never before had a conversation like this with anyone else, and that this was a specific and significant thing. He asked her to marry him on the first day of the new year, 1884, with the particular directness of a man who had decided against delay and had made his decision absolutely. He did not have a ring because it was 2 days after the decision and the jeweler in Caldwell had been closed for the holiday, but he had words, which were honest and specific and not particularly flowery, and he told her that he loved her intelligence and her stubbornness and her absolute commitment to what was right, and that he had no interest in a life with a woman who would be less than exactly who she was, and that he would like very much to build something with her if she would permit it. Annie Donnelly, who had survived the death of her father, a cattle baron's fraud scheme, a break-in, an attempted eviction, an appellate proceeding, and 6 weeks of calculated social isolation, considered his proposal for approximately 10 seconds. "Yes," she said, "under the following conditions." He looked at her. "I keep the deed research work," she said. "I have 3 inquiries in Wichita and 1 in Topeka that need resolution, and I intend to continue taking cases. I am building something with this work and it matters and I will not give it up." "I would never ask you to," he said. "The homestead is mine," she said, "legally and in every practical sense. My father built it and I defended it and it is mine." "Obviously," he said, "and I would like a ring that is actually mine and not a family heirloom from somewhere you'd be carrying complicated feelings about," she said. "I had already planned to go to the jeweler tomorrow morning," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Then yes," she said, "with no further conditions." He did go to the jeweler the next morning, and came back with a ring set with a small dark amber stone that he had chosen because it was the color of her eyes, which he did not tell her because he thought it might be too much. But Annie saw him looking at her eyes, and then at the stone with an expression he was not entirely controlling, and understood completely. They were married in March 1884, in a ceremony at the Caldwell Methodist Church that was attended by most of the town, including the Beaumont family, who had traveled in from their farm for the occasion. The ceremony was conducted by a pastor who had known Annie's father, and said several things about Patrick Donnelly's character that made Annie's eyes bright for a moment before she collected herself. Eli said his vows with the same quality he brought to everything that mattered to him, which was total, ungarnished sincerity, and Annie said hers with a clarity and a directness that made the pastor smile and several members of the congregation exchange glances of the particular kind that indicated general approval. After the wedding, they rode home to the Donnelly homestead, which was now also Eli's home, and which they spent the first spring of their marriage making into a more permanent place. Eli was a capable carpenter, a skill he had picked up in Missouri and never lost, and he extended the kitchen and added a room to the east side of the house with the practical intention of eventually having a family. Annie continued her deed research work through the spring and into the summer, taking on 3 new cases from homesteaders who had heard her name through the territory, and believed, with considerable justification, that she might be able to help them. 2 of those cases turned on exactly the kind of documentation fraud she had identified in the Creed case. Both were ultimately resolved in the homesteader's favor. She began corresponding regularly with a land law attorney in Topeka named Harrington, who had been following her cases with professional interest, and had proposed a formal working arrangement by which she would conduct deed research and title analysis for his practice on a consulting basis. It was more income than she had anticipated and more recognition than she had expected, and she accepted with a letter that was professionally composed and personally satisfied. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch that Eli had built along the south face of the house, looking out over the Nineska River and the tall grass prairie, and talked about their days and their cases and their plans. Sometimes they argued about property law because they both had strong opinions and enjoyed the exercise. Sometimes they sat quietly, which was also good. Eli had, over the months since the eviction confrontation, become known in Sumner County not simply as a law enforcer, but as the sheriff who had refused to execute a fraudulent eviction order and had subsequently broken a systematic land fraud scheme. His standing in the community had, if anything, improved. He ran for re-election that fall and won by a margin that left his nearest competitor with very few illusions about the result. In the autumn of 1884, Annie told Eli she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table, across the same spot where she had first laid out her deed fraud analysis, which was where all the significant things in their life seemed to happen, and he sat very still for a moment, and then stood up and held her for a long time without saying anything because there was nothing adequate to say. Their son was born in the early summer of 1885, a strong and healthy boy they named Patrick, after Annie's father. He had Eli's dark hair and Annie's eyes, the river amber ones, and he announced his arrival into the world with a volume and insistence that seemed to bode well for his future assertiveness. Eli held his son for the first time with the careful, slightly dazed expression of a new father, and Annie watched him from the bed where she had just conducted the most difficult physical work of her life, with the methodical endurance of a woman who approached all challenges with complete commitment, and she thought that this was, in its own way, also a victory. A different kind than the one in the circuit court, but rooted in the same place. In the refusal to be dispossessed of what was rightfully yours. The Donnelly homestead, which was now the Wilcox homestead though Annie kept the name Donnelly in her professional capacity as a deed researcher, grew. Eli built a second-room addition in the spring of 1886, in preparation for what they both suspected was an expanding family. The vegetable garden was expanded. The fence line along the river was improved. A new horse joined the two they already had. Annie's work continued to grow as well. The consulting arrangement with the Topeka attorney had led to connections with 2 additional legal practices, and by 1886, she was managing a steady caseload of title examinations that brought in enough income to be genuinely significant, and had built her a reputation in territorial legal circles that was, by any measure, remarkable for a woman of her era. She was consulted by deed researchers in 3 neighboring counties who came to her with complex chain of title problems, and she solved most of them. She was aware of the injustice that limited her formal standing, that she could not practice law herself, could not argue before a court in her own name, could only work through the attorneys who recognized her expertise and were honest enough to credit it. She named that injustice clearly when she encountered it, and refused to pretend it was not real. But she also built what she could build within the constraints of what was possible in 1886 in Kansas, and what she built was substantial. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara, arrived in the winter of 1887. Annie had chosen the name herself, having learned from Eli about his former engagement and understanding, with her characteristic precision, that the name had weight for him that deserved to be re-examined and transformed. It was a gift of a particular kind, the kind that said, "I know your whole story, including the parts that were difficult, and I am not afraid of any of it." Eli had looked at her when she suggested the name and understood completely what she was offering, and accepted it with the quiet fullness of a man who knew he had been given something rare. Clara was a small, determined girl from the first hours of her life, dark-eyed and watchful in a way that made the Caldwell doctor say she was going to be a thoughtful one. Patrick, who was 2 years old when Clara arrived, inspected his sister with the exploratory seriousness of a child who had not yet learned to perform emotions for an audience and declared her, in the terms available to him, acceptable. Life on the Nineska River in the spring of 1888 had a quality that Annie sometimes stopped to notice with the deliberate intention of a person who knew that good things could be lost if you forgot to acknowledge them. The morning light across the prairie. The way Eli looked when he came in from checking the horses, still carrying the outdoor air with him. The sound of Patrick following him around the yard, asking questions that Eli answered with full seriousness regardless of their content. The growing weight of Clara on her hip. The legal work continued. In the spring of 1888, Annie identified a new pattern of deed fraud in the western part of Sumner County, connected to a railroad land acquisition scheme that was more sophisticated than the Creed operation and required more documentation to untangle. She spent 4 months on it, working from the kitchen table with Clara in a cradle nearby and Patrick playing on the floor, drafting a legal analysis that was eventually submitted as part of a formal complaint to the Territorial Land Commissioner. It was the most complex case she had ever worked on, and it succeeded. The railroad's fraudulent acquisition of 3 homesteads was ruled void, and the Territorial Land Commissioner's office wrote to Annie directly to acknowledge her contribution to the investigation. It was the first time a woman had been formally credited in an official territorial land ruling in Kansas, as far as anyone could document. Eli read the commissioner's letter and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Your father would have been proud of that too." "I know," Annie said, and folded the letter carefully and put it in the tin box that no longer needed to be hidden under the floorboard. There were harder days too. The winter of 1887 had been severe, and the spring flooding along the Nineska had damaged the east room of the house and destroyed a season's worth of kitchen garden. A particularly difficult eviction case in the summer of 1888, involving an elderly exodusters family who had come to Kansas from Tennessee seeking the promised freedom of the frontier, only to encounter the same economic machinery of dispossession, haunted Annie for months afterward, even though she won it. The injustice that had produced the need for the case was not erased by the legal victory, and she knew it and said so, and continued working. Eli dealt with the specific moral weight of frontier law enforcement, which required him regularly to navigate between what the law said and what was right, and to find ways to serve both. And there were moments when those two things were not easily reconciled. He talked about those moments with Annie, who had clear eyes and no patience for comfortable rationalizations, and who helped him think through what was actually defensible and what was not, which was the most useful thing anyone had ever done for him professionally. In the autumn of 1889, when Kansas was formally admitted to the Union as a state and the territorial legal structure shifted into the new framework of statehood, Annie found herself with an unexpected opportunity. A newly organized state land title office was being staffed, and the position of chief title examiner was posted publicly. The man who had been appointed as head of the office was a Topeka attorney named Harrington, the same one who had been Annie's consulting partner for 5 years. He wrote to her directly to ask whether she would consider the position. It was a formal government appointment. It came with official standing and a salary, and the authority to render binding title opinions on disputed land claims throughout the new state of Kansas. It was, effectively, what Annie had been doing informally for 6 years, made official by the authority of a new state government. It also required relocating to Topeka. She and Eli talked about it for 3 evenings, sitting on the porch with the Nineska moving dark and silver in the autumn moonlight, with Patrick asleep inside and Clara moving sleepily in Annie's arms. They talked about what it would mean and what it would cost and what would be gained. And Eli said what he always said when she faced a professional decision, which was that she should do what was right for the work she was called to do, and they would build around it. Because the work was not separate from who she was, and he would no more ask her to diminish it than he would ask her to change her eyes. He submitted his own name for consideration as the first county sheriff under the new Kansas state structure, which carried a formal state appointment and different jurisdiction than the old county arrangement, and was appointed by the state authority through Topeka, which created a practical logistical path toward Topeka that had not existed a week before. They moved to Topeka in the spring of 1890. The Nineska homestead was leased to the Beaumont family's eldest son, who was newly married and looking for good land to farm, which felt, to both Annie and Eli, like the land going to exactly the right people. Their house in Topeka was larger than the homestead necessarily, with 3 children now, because Annie had found herself expecting again in the winter of 1889, and their second son, named Thomas, arrived in the hot Kansas summer of 1890, red-faced and vocal, and exactly as substantial as his older brother had been, which was very. Annie's office at the State Land Title Division was on the 2nd floor of the new state government building, with a window that looked east toward the railroad depot. She had a proper desk and an official title, and a small staff of 2 clerks who had been initially uncertain about working for a woman, and had revised their opinion within 3 weeks of observing her work. The first major case she handled in her official capacity involved a disputed grant along the Arkansas River that had been contested for 11 years. She resolved it in 14 weeks. The ruling was adopted verbatim by the state land court. The Topeka Daily Capital published a piece about it, which Annie read and folded and put in the tin box that traveled with her everywhere. Eli found his work in the state law structure interesting and frequently frustrating in the specific way of new institutional bureaucracies, but he was good at it, and the contacts he had developed over 6 years in Sumner County gave him a network that proved useful in ways that were not immediately obvious. He was, by the assessment of the people who worked with him, exactly the kind of lawman a new state needed in its formative period. Firm, principled, and specifically interested in the law serving the people, it was supposed to serve rather than the money it was convenient to serve. Patrick started school in Topeka in the fall of 1890 and immediately established himself as the kind of student who asked questions that teachers found simultaneously impressive and exhausting. Clara, who was 3, spent her days in constant, intense observation of everything around her, and had already demonstrated a memory that her mother recognized with a private smile. Thomas remained primarily concerned with food and sleep, and the specific injustice of not being the same size as his siblings, which he was working on with considerable determination. On the evening of their 6th wedding anniversary in the spring of 1890, Eli and Annie sat on the porch of their Topeka house and watched the Kansas sky go through its long evening sequence from blue to gold to deep rose to violet, and Annie said, unprompted, "I think about that afternoon often, when you came to evict me." "I think about it every day," Eli said simply. She looked at him. "What do you think about?" "Your face," he said, "when you put those documents on the table. The way you looked at me, like you were deciding whether I was worth explaining anything to." "I was deciding exactly that," she said. "I know," he said. "And then you decided yes. And you explained it in 4 minutes and turned my entire understanding of the situation completely around. You let me," she said. "That was the thing I wasn't prepared for, that you actually listened." "You were right," he said. "Why would I not listen?" She thought about all the men who had been presented with expertise and knowledge, and had not listened because of the source. And she thought about how rare it was to encounter a man who simply evaluated whether a thing was true and acted accordingly. And she thought about how the randomness of fate had placed such a man at her door on the day she needed one. "I'm very glad the eviction notice came to your office and not someone else's," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day." He put his arm around her, and she settled into his side with the easy comfort of a woman who had chosen her place and was certain of it, and they sat together in the Topeka evening with their 3 children asleep inside, and the rest of their lives arranged before them like a survey of good land, full of possibility, completely theirs. The years that followed in Topeka layered goodness onto goodness in the particular way of lives that have been built on solid foundations. Annie's reputation as a title examiner became known well beyond Kansas. She received inquiries from Colorado and Oklahoma Territory, and once from as far as California, involving a land grant case with origins in the old Mexican land system that a San Francisco attorney believed she was the only person in the country with the specific expertise to untangle. She took the case and resolved it by correspondence over 8 months, and the attorney sent her a letter afterward that said she was the finest deed analyst he had ever encountered in 30 years of practice. Patrick grew into a serious, curious boy who showed, at the age of 9, a specific interest in mathematics that his teacher said was unusual, and Annie recognized in it the same quality of mind that had driven her toward land surveys and legal documents. She began, on weekend afternoons, teaching him the foundations of property law and surveying mathematics, the same way Patrick Donnelly had taught her at a kitchen table in the evenings, and the continuity of that gave her a feeling she could not entirely articulate but which was something close to completeness. Clara was, at 8, demonstrating the sharp and slightly alarming clarity of perception that had been visible since her infancy. She listened to everything with a quiet intentness and asked questions that cut directly to the center of whatever was being discussed, a quality that her mother recognized, and her father regarded with the specific warm pride of a man who could see exactly where it was going to lead, and thought it was going to lead somewhere very fine. Thomas, who was 5 when they returned to this accounting of things, was entirely himself, physical and cheerful, and with a laugh that was the loudest sound in any room he occupied. He was learning to ride with Eli's patient instruction and the slightly reckless enthusiasm of a child who had yet to learn that horses were larger than he was. Eli's work in the state law structure continued to evolve. In 1893, he was appointed to a state commission examining the enforcement frameworks for the new homestead protection statutes that had been passed in the wake of several large-scale land fraud cases, including the one Annie had built her reputation resolving. The commission's work was directly informed by Annie's research and the patterns she had documented, and her name appeared in the commission's final report multiple times as the foundational source for the legal framework being proposed. It was not the full credit she deserved. The world of 1893 was not yet a world that gave women full credit for their contributions to public legal frameworks, but it was more credit than women usually received, and it was documented, and it mattered. They visited Caldwell in the summer of 1894, making the journey by train, which made the distance they had traveled in all senses of that phrase very clear. The Nineska homestead was green and well-tended under the Beaumont family's stewardship. The sheriff's office where Eli had sat across from Annie while she made her first case to him had a new occupant, a young man named Hayes who had been recommended by Eli when he left. Annie walked through the homestead, which felt smaller than memory, and stood in the kitchen where she had spread her documents across the table and waited for the law to arrive, and thought about her father, and about the woman she had been then, and the woman she was now, and about the long, clear thread of effort and intelligence and love that connected those 2 points. Eli found her there and stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she covered one of his hands with hers. "No regrets," he said. "None," she said, "not a single one." They walked out into the Kansas evening together, and the homestead was behind them, and the river was ahead of them, and the land stretched out in every direction under the great open sky, not threatening but offered, available to anyone strong enough and smart enough and willing enough to hold onto what was rightfully theirs. The Beaumont boy, who was 20 now and farming the land with the careful attention it deserved, waved to them from the far fence line, and Annie waved back, and Eli did too, and the gesture was small and ordinary and contained everything. They took the train back to Topeka the following morning, 3 children variously asleep and awake around them in the rail car, Patrick with his nose in a mathematics text, Clara watching the passing landscape with that precise attention she brought to everything, Thomas asleep against Eli's arm with the complete confidence of a child who has never doubted that he is held. Annie looked out the window at the Kansas plain moving past, the tall grass and the silver rivers and the great sky that was never the same twice, and thought about her father's teaching and Creed's fraudulent deed, and the 4 minutes at the kitchen table that had changed the direction of her life and Eli's life, and several other people's lives besides. She thought about how a single fatal legal flaw in a single filed document had been the hinge point of all of it. The thing that corrupt men missed when they chose to falsify a document was that documents had to cohere. They had to match all the other documents in the system, and systems built by careful people over time had a long memory. The flaw was always there if you knew how to look for it. Eli, watching her, said quietly, "You're working something out." "I'm thinking about surveying notation," she said. He smiled. It was a specific smile, the one that said he was thinking something fond and was not going to say it completely, but she could see it anyway. "Is this the one about the TPRM versus SPRM system?" "No," she said. "I resolved that one in 1883. "You did," he said. "I was there." She looked at him, and the smile she gave him back was the real one, the underneath one, the one that had been there since the lamplight evening when he had kissed her over a table full of documents, and she had accepted it with the certainty of someone who had done her due diligence on the situation and reached a definitive conclusion. "You were there," she agreed, "attempting to evict me." "I had a legal document," he said, the same tone he might have used in 1883 defending that position. "You had a fraudulent legal document," she said. "I did not know it was fraudulent at the time," he said. "You knew something was wrong," she said. "You sat down." He was quiet for a moment. The train moved through the Kansas landscape, carrying all of them homeward. "Yes," he said, "I sat down." She took his hand on the seat between them and held it, and the train carried them east through the long golden light of the Kansas afternoon, and Patrick fell asleep over his mathematics text, and Clara turned from the window and asked a question about the river they were crossing that demonstrated she had been thinking about hydrology for considerably longer than anyone had realized. And Thomas stirred against Eli's arm and did not wake, and the land moved past them. Claimed and documented and defended, and theirs, all of it theirs, as it had always been meant to be. In the years that followed, Annie took on a role that she had not anticipated and which grew naturally from everything she had built. She began informally mentoring younger women who came to the state land office with the specific intelligence and blocked opportunity that she recognized from her own experience. She taught them deed analysis and chain of title examination and the specific legal language of territorial grants, the same way her father had taught her, and she watched them take those tools into the world and use them, and the satisfaction of it was a different kind than the satisfaction of winning her own cases, but it was no less real. One of those young women, a Cherokee woman named Judith Sixkiller from the Indian Territory border, had a mind for document analysis that Annie described to Eli as the finest she had ever taught. And she worked to ensure that Judith's access to the case files and the professional network she had built was as full as she could make it within the limitations of what 1896 Kansas could support for a woman who also faced the additional weight of racial injustice in a territory where that weight was very heavy indeed. It was imperfect. Annie said so. She worked within those imperfections and pushed against them where she could, and documented all of it in the same careful hand she brought to everything. In 1898, Patrick Donnelly Wilcox, who was 13 years old and had been working through his mother's more advanced surveying mathematics texts for 2 years, produced, of his own initiative, a paper resolving a notational inconsistency in the standard Kansas boundary survey reference system that his mother had identified as a potential problem and set aside for further study. It was good work. His mother read it twice and then showed it to Eli with an expression of such transparent maternal pride mixed with professional respect that Eli kept the memory of it for the rest of his life as one of the finest things he had ever seen. "He's going to be a surveyor," Eli said. "Or a lawyer," Annie said. "Or both." "Both," they said together. The new century came and the world began to shift in all its large ways, the ways that eventually reach even the Kansas plains. And Annie and Eli moved through the changes with the particular steadiness of people who have built on solid foundations and know the difference between things that are being transformed and things that are being lost. In 1901, on a bright spring afternoon when the redbuds were out along the creek behind their Topeka house, Annie showed Eli a letter that had arrived from a publisher in New York who had been referred to her by the Topeka Daily Capital. The publisher was requesting that Annie write a comprehensive guide to deed examination and chain of title analysis for homesteaders and small landowners throughout the Western Territories. A practical manual, written accessibly, that could give ordinary people the tools to understand and defend their own land claims. The knowledge of a lifetime, set down in a form that could travel anywhere. She showed him the letter and watched his face and waited. He read it, he set it down, he looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I haven't asked a question," she said. "You were about to," he said. "And the answer is yes, obviously yes, without qualification." She looked at him with the river-amber eyes that had not changed in the 18 years since he had first seen them, burning with the specific ferocity of someone who knew she was going to win. And she said, "I would need a dedicated workspace and probably an additional year before the manuscript could be complete, and I may need to travel for research." "You have always had a dedicated workspace," he said, "and a year is nothing, and travel is fine." "The children are at various demanding ages," she said. "We will manage the children," he said, "as we have always managed the children, which is jointly and with considerable discussion and occasional argument about method." Annie laughed. "Occasionally." "Frequently," he said. She folded the publisher's letter and put it in the tin box. The book took 2 years. It was dedicated to Patrick Donnelly, deed clerk of Philadelphia, and to all those who hold land by right of law and courage. It was published in 1903 and sold 1,400 copies in its first year, primarily to homesteaders and small landowners in the Western Territories, which was exactly the audience for whom it had been written. 3 county land offices adopted it as a standard reference. The Topeka Daily Capital called it the most practically useful legal document produced in the history of Kansas Territory. A second edition was requested by the publisher within 18 months. On the evening the author's copies arrived from New York, 6 of them in a cardboard package that smelled of fresh ink and binding glue. Annie held the first copy for a long moment before she opened it, and Eli stood beside her with his hand on her back. And Patrick, who was 18 now and had already been accepted to the University of Kansas to study engineering, came and looked over her shoulder with the specific pride of a firstborn child who understood what had gone into something. Clara, who was 15 and already the sharpest mind in her school by the assessment of every teacher who had encountered her, said quietly, "It's yours, Mama. It's completely and entirely yours." Thomas, 13 and fully his own person, said it looked like it had a lot of words, which was accurate, and that he was proud of her, which was genuine, and went back to what he had been doing. Annie opened the book to the dedication page and read it, and then she closed it and looked at Eli and said, "I think we should celebrate." "We absolutely should," he said. They celebrated with a dinner Annie made from her mother's recipes, the one she had been keeping since she was 12 years old, with all 5 of them at the table, and the conversation going in 7 directions at once the way it did in households full of people who all had strong opinions. And at the end of the evening, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Annie and Eli sat on the porch in the warm spring night of Topeka, 1903, and looked at the sky that was very full of stars. "We have had," Eli said, "a remarkable life." "We are having a remarkable life," Annie said, present tense. "Yes," he said, present tense. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the spring night together with all the years behind them and all the years still ahead of them, and the land stretched out around them in every direction, documented and defended, and fully, finally, completely theirs. And somewhere in the Topeka State Archives, properly filed and correctly notated using the TPRM reference system, was the deed to the Nineska River homestead, clean and valid and rooted in the original 1867 grant, bearing Annie Donnelly's name, which was the only name it had ever rightfully held, and which it would continue to hold for as long as there were documents and people honest enough to read them.